What if I told you that one president installed a bathtub so large it required 6 men to move it? Another lived in a 300-foot long house because he was mad at his political party. And one president's home was demolished and turned into a parking lot. Tonight, we're taking a very slow tour through the private homes of every U.S. president. Not the White House, their actual houses. The places where they ate breakfast, argued with their spouses, made questionable decorating choices, and sometimes died unexpectedly after eating cherries. Before we start, if you enjoy falling asleep to historical absurdity, go ahead and subscribe. Maybe like the video. Or don't. You'll be asleep soon anyway, so close your eyes if you want. Dim the lights. You're about to drift off somewhere between Mount Vernon and a ranch in Texas. Let's begin with a man who owned one of the most famous homes in America, but died because doctors drained half his blood. George Washington, Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon sits on the Potomac River in Virginia, and it is exactly what you'd expect from a man trying very hard to prove he wasn't a king while also living in an 11,000 square foot mansion. Washington inherited the property from his half-brother in 1752, but he spent decades expanding it, designing additions, and turning it into the most famous home in America that isn't painted white. The house has 2 stories, 21 rooms, and a massive 2-story piazza overlooking the river. That piazza was Washington's idea. He wanted a place to stand and look pensively at water, which is a very founding father thing to do. The whole estate was a working plantation, and at its peak, it spanned 8,000 acres. Washington was obsessed with farming. He kept meticulous records of crop rotations, weather patterns, and soil quality, which is the 18th century version of a spreadsheet addiction. Inside, the mansion is surprisingly colorful. The walls are painted in bold greens and blues. There's a dining room with Prussian blue walls that Washington called the New Room, even though it took him 15 years to finish it. Procrastination is timeless. He also ran a distillery on the property. By 1800, it was one of the largest whiskey distilleries in America, producing 11,000 gallons a year. So, yes, the father of our country was also technically a large-scale liquor distributor. Washington died at Mount Vernon in 1799 after riding around his estate in freezing rain, refusing to change out of wet clothes, and then letting doctors bleed him excessively. The house remains. His decorating choices remain. And his reputation as a man who could not tell a lie but absolutely could design a dramatic entrance remains intact. But not every founding father wanted a riverside mansion. John Adams, Peacefield. John Adams bought a house in Quincy, Massachusetts in 1788 and immediately named it Peacefield because the American Revolution was over and he was tired. The house itself was built in 1731, long before Adams got his hands on it. It's a Georgian-style structure made of wood and clapboard, with 7 bedrooms, a study, and the kind of New England practicality that says, "We don't need a piazza, we need warmth." Adams was the first president to live in the White House, but he only stayed there for 4 months before losing the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. After that, he returned to Peacefield and never left. He lived there for another 25 years, spending his retirement reading, writing letters, and nurturing a grudge against Alexander Hamilton that outlasted Hamilton's life. The house wasn't grand, it was comfortable. The library eventually held around 14,000 books, which Adams accumulated obsessively. He read in multiple languages and left angry annotations in the margins because subtweeting didn't exist yet, but the sentiment did. His son, John Quincy Adams, inherited the house and added even more books. The Adamses were not a family that traveled light, emotionally or literarily. One of the best details about Peacefield is that it stayed in the Adams family for 4 generations. It became a kind of intellectual compound where former presidents, failed presidential candidates, and various accomplished Adamses would brood about the state of the Republic. John Adams died there on July 4th, 1826, the same day as Thomas Jefferson. It was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. History loves a dramatic callback. The house still stands. It's now a National Historic Site. You can visit it and feel the weight of New England intellectualism pressing down on you like a wool blanket in August. But if you thought that was a lot of books, just wait. Thomas Jefferson, Monticello. Thomas Jefferson designed Monticello himself, which should tell you everything. The man wrote the Declaration of Independence, founded the University of Virginia, owned over 600 enslaved people, and still found time to obsess over door hinges. Monticello sits on a mountaintop near Charlottesville, Virginia, and it is a neoclassical architectural flex that took about 40 years to complete because Jefferson could not stop redesigning it. The house has 21 rooms, 11,000 square feet, and more clever gadgets than you'd expect from 1776. There's a two-faced clock that shows the day of the week. There are dumbwaiters built into the dining room fireplace so enslaved workers could send up wine bottles without being seen. There are alcove beds, rotating bookstands, and a weather vane on the roof connected to a dial in the ceiling so Jefferson could check wind direction without going outside. It's the Enlightenment version of a smart home, except nothing was smart about the contradictions baked into its foundation. Jefferson was obsessed with privacy and control. He wanted innovation. He wanted beauty. He wanted to pretend the labor that made it possible was invisible. The house reflects that. It's stunning and uncomfortable, brilliant and deeply troubling. He died at Monticello on July 4th, 1826, the same day as John Adams, exactly 50 years after the Declaration. He was 83 and broke. The estate was sold to pay off debts. It passed through multiple owners before being preserved. Today, Monticello is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a reminder that genius and moral failure can share the same blueprint. The architecture is top tier. The legacy is complicated. The hidden staircases are cool but creepy. And speaking of complicated Virginia estates, the next president had one too. James Madison, Montpelier. James Madison's home, Montpelier, is in Orange County, Virginia, about 30 miles from Monticello, because apparently all the founding fathers wanted to live within visiting distance of each other and argue about federalism over dinner. Madison inherited the core of the house from his father, but over the years, he expanded it into a 22-room mansion with red brick, white columns, and the kind of symmetry that screams, "I wrote the Constitution." Madison wasn't as obsessed with architecture as Jefferson, but his wife, Dolly Madison, had opinions. She's the one who made Montpelier feel less like a political salon and more like an actual home. She entertained constantly. After Madison's presidency, they retired to Montpelier full-time, and Dolly turned it into the place everyone wanted to visit. She served ice cream, which in the 1820s was still considered exotic and impressive. The house itself has been through a lot. After the Madisons, it was sold and resold. In the early 1900s, it was bought by the DuPont family, who added wings, changed the interior, and basically turned it into their own private country estate. For decades, historians weren't even sure what the original Madison's version looked like. In the 2000s, a massive restoration project stripped away the DuPont additions and returned the house to its 1820 configuration. It's now one of the most accurately restored presidential homes in the country, which is a nice way of saying they had to undo a century of rich people doing whatever they wanted. Madison died at Montpelier in 1836. Dolly stayed for a bit, then moved to Washington, D.C., and eventually had to sell the estate to pay off debts. The house outlasted the money, which is a recurring theme we'll see again, and again, and again. But financial trouble wasn't unique to Madison. James Monroe, Highland. James Monroe's Virginia estate, Highland, later renamed Lawn Highland, sits just a few miles from Jefferson's Monticello. Jefferson actually helped Monroe pick the location because these founding fathers really did want to be neighbors. Monroe bought the land in 1793, and the house he built was modest by presidential standards. It was originally a 1.5-story wood frame structure, practical and unpretentious, which matched Monroe's personality. Monroe called the estate Highland. Later owners renamed it Lawn Highland, presumably because they thought it sounded more poetic. Monroe didn't care about poetic. He cared about farming, paying off debt, and trying not to go completely bankrupt while serving his country. Spoiler alert, he failed at the bankruptcy part. Monroe lived at Highland on and off throughout his political career. After his presidency ended in 1825, he retired there, but financial problems forced him to sell the estate in 1826. He also owned another property, Oak Hill, in Loudoun County, Virginia, which was larger and more formal. That's where he spent his final post-presidential years, though he eventually had to leave that one too because of money troubles. The house at Highland was never grand. It was expanded over the years by later owners, but during Monroe's time it was small, functional, and surrounded by working farmland. He grew tobacco, wheat, and had orchards. He also had enslaved workers because Virginia in the early 1800s was built on that system, and Monroe, like many of his contemporaries, benefited from it while occasionally expressing vague discomfort about it in letters. Monroe died in New York City in 1831, not at either of his Virginia estates because by then he couldn't afford to keep them. He's the first president on this list to die broke and away from home, but he won't be the last. And speaking of inheritances and family homes, let's talk about a son who moved back in with Dad's legacy, John Quincy Adams. The old house. John Quincy Adams didn't buy a new house. He inherited his father's. Peacefield, the same Quincy, Massachusetts, estate where John Adams had brooded for 25 years, became John Quincy Adams' retirement home after his presidency ended in 1829. It was already full of books, memories, and the intellectual baggage of 2 generations of Adamses who thought way too much about everything. John Quincy expanded the library. He added more books, more papers, more annotated margins full of opinions no one asked for. He built a stone library addition in 1870, though he didn't live to see it completed. His son, Charles Francis Adams, finished it. The Adams family kept everything: letters, diaries, legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, old drafts of speeches. If it involved words, they saved it. The house became a repository of American political history, filtered through one very serious, very accomplished, and occasionally very cranky family. John Quincy Adams served in Congress after his presidency, which was unusual. He commuted between Washington, D.C. and Quincy, but Peacefield remained his anchor. He planted trees, he swam in the river. He wrote in his diary almost every single day for decades, documenting everything from political debates to the weather to his perpetual disappointment in humanity. Adams died in 1848, not at Peacefield, but in the U.S. Capitol, after collapsing on the House floor. He was 80 years old and still arguing about slavery when he went down. They brought him to the speaker's room, where he died 2 days later. His body was returned to Quincy and buried near his father. The house stayed in the family until 1946, when the Adams descendants donated it to the National Park Service. 4 generations lived there. That's 158 years of one family refusing to move. But not every president was so attached to family property. Andrew Jackson, the Hermitage. Andrew Jackson bought the land for the Hermitage near Nashville, Tennessee in 1804, back when he was still just a lawyer, judge, and duelist with a violent streak. The name Hermitage is ironic because Jackson was never a hermit. He was loud, combative, and constantly surrounded by people, drama, and enemies. But he loved the name, so the Hermitage it was. The first house on the property was a simple log cabin. Then came a larger brick Federal-style house. Then in 1834, the house caught fire. Most of the interior was destroyed. Jackson, who was president at the time and living in Washington, D.C., had it rebuilt in the Greek Revival style, complete with tall white columns and a grand facade. It was imposing, symmetrical, and designed to make visitors feel like they were entering a temple, which is exactly the vibe Jackson wanted. The estate was a plantation. At its height, it spanned over 1,000 acres and relied on the labor of more than 150 enslaved people. Jackson's wealth came from cotton, land speculation, and slave labor. He was also a slaveholder who bought and sold people throughout his life. The Hermitage reflects both his political power and the brutality of the system that sustained it. Jackson died at the Hermitage in 1845. His body is buried in the garden next to his wife, Rachel, who died before he became president. He adored her, mourned her publicly, and blamed his political enemies for her death. The estate eventually fell into financial trouble and was sold. It's now a museum. Visiting the Hermitage today means confronting that contradiction. Beautiful architecture built on violence, carefully preserved for tourists. It's uncomfortable, it should be. But at least Jackson's house still exists. Martin Van Buren, Lindenwald. Martin Van Buren bought Lindenwald in 1839, right after losing his re-election bid to William Henry Harrison. The house is in Kinderhook, New York, Van Buren's hometown, and he retired there to lick his wounds and pretend he wasn't devastated by losing the presidency after only one term. The house was originally built in the late 1790s, a modest, two-story Federal-style brick structure. Van Buren liked it. It wasn't flashy. It was respectable. Then his son, Smith Thompson Van Buren, decided the house needed a makeover. In the 1849 renovation, Smith added an Italianate tower, updated the windows, and gave the whole place a trendier Victorian look. Van Buren went along with it, probably because he didn't have the energy to argue. He'd already spent his political capital. Now he was just a retired president trying to stay relevant. Van Buren lived at Lindenwald for 21 years. He gardened, he wrote his memoirs, he stayed politically active, supporting the Free Soil Party and opposing the expansion of slavery, which was a stronger stance than he'd taken as president. The house became his base for all of that. It wasn't grand. It wasn't iconic. It was fine. He died at Lindenwald in 1862, at the age of 79 during the Civil War. The estate stayed in the family for a while, then passed through several owners before the National Park Service took it over in the 1974. Today, it's a National Historic Site, which is the participation trophy of presidential homes. Lindenwald ranks mid-tier. Forgettable, like Van Buren himself, which is almost impressive considering he was president. And speaking of short presidencies, the next president barely had time to unpack. William Henry Harrison, Grouseland. William Henry Harrison built Grouseland in Vincennes, Indiana in 1804, back when he was governor of the Indiana Territory, and Indiana wasn't even a state yet. The house is named after the grouse birds that apparently lived nearby, which feels like the kind of detail a man would find charming right up until he died of pneumonia after giving the longest inaugural address in history. Grouseland is a two-story brick mansion with 13 rooms, which was massive for frontier Indiana in 1804. It had a stone foundation, walnut woodwork, and the kind of Georgian architecture that screamed, "I'm bringing civilization to this territory whether it's ready or not." Harrison used the house as both his home and the territorial capital. He held treaty negotiations there, he entertained visitors, he made decisions that displaced Native American tribes and opened up land for white settlement. He lived there for almost a decade. Then he moved on to other political positions, fought in the War of 1812, and eventually became a war hero, which helped him win the presidency in 1840. He was 68 years old when he was inaugurated, the oldest president elected at that point. He gave a 2-hour inaugural address in freezing weather without a coat or hat, because apparently proving you're tough is more important than not dying. Harrison died 31 days later, on April 4th, 1841, making him the shortest-serving president in history. He never made it back to Grouseland. The house stayed in private hands for years before being restored and turned into a museum in the 1909. It's a fine house. Harrison barely got to enjoy the presidency, and he never retired anywhere. At least the grouse probably appreciated the peace and quiet after he left. John Tyler, Sherwood Forest Plantation. John Tyler bought Sherwood Forest Plantation in 1842 while he was still president, which tells you how much he trusted his re-election chances. Spoiler: he didn't run. Tyler had become president after William Henry Harrison died, and his own party expelled him for vetoing their bills too many times. So he bought a Virginia plantation, named it after Robin Hood's forest because he saw himself as a political outlaw and prepared for retirement at age 52. The house is the longest frame house in America. It stretches 300 feet from end to end, which is excessive. Tyler added a ballroom, expanded wings, and created what he called a Tyler-style layout. The house is one room deep for its entire length, which means every room has windows on both sides for cross-ventilation. This was his solution to Virginia summers before air conditioning. It's actually clever, but it's still 300 feet of I'm not over being kicked out of the Whig Party. Tyler lived at Sherwood Forest for nearly 20 years after his presidency. He had 15 children, 7 from his first marriage and 8 from his second. His second wife, Julia, was 30 years younger than him, and they had their last child when Tyler was 70. The house had to accommodate this massive family, plus enslaved workers who ran the plantation. Tyler owned about 70 people at the time of his death. He died at Sherwood Forest in January 1862, shortly after being elected to the Confederate House of Representatives. Yes, the former U.S. president died as a traitor to the Union. He's the only president whose death wasn't officially mourned by the federal government. No flags were lowered. The house stayed in the Tyler family and remains a private residence today, still owned by descendants. Sherwood Forest ranks high for sheer audacity. 300 feet of frame house is a statement. Whether it's a good statement is debatable. But at least Tyler got to enjoy his retirement, which is more than the previous 2 presidents managed. And speaking of presidents who didn't quite get their retirement plan sorted, the next one worked himself to death. James K. Polk, Polk Place. James K. Polk bought a lot in Nashville, Tennessee in 1847 and built a grand house he called Polk Place. It was a 2-story brick mansion with tall columns, Greek Revival styling, and about 14 rooms. Polk was still president when construction began, but he was already exhausted. He'd promised to serve only 1 term, and he meant it. Mostly because the presidency nearly killed him before he could retire. Polk moved into Polk Place in March 1849, immediately after leaving office. He was 53 years old and looked 70. He'd worked constantly for 4 years, expanding U.S. territory, provoking a war with Mexico, and micromanaging every detail of his administration. He didn't trust anyone else to do anything. So he just did it all himself, which is a great way to die young. He died at Polk Place 3 months later, in June 1849. The cause was probably cholera, though some historians think it was just exhaustion and chronic diarrhea, which is an undignified way to go, but very on brand for Polk. He barely got to enjoy the house. His wife, Sarah, lived there for another 42 years, hosting visitors, preserving his papers, and wearing black every single day for the rest of her life. Polk Place stood for decades after Sarah's death. Then in 1900, it was demolished. The state of Tennessee moved the Polk's bodies to the state capitol grounds, and the house was completely erased. Today, there's nothing left. No museum, no marker, just a parking lot and a vague memory that a president once lived there. Polk Place ranks low by default because it no longer exists. But even if it still stood, the fact that Polk only lived there for 3 months before dying would be hard to overlook. It's less a home and more a mausoleum with a brief occupancy period. At least the next president had more time to enjoy his estate, even if he also died unexpectedly. Zachary Taylor, Springfield Plantation. Zachary Taylor owned Springfield Plantation near Louisville, Kentucky. He bought it in 1840, back when he was still an Army general and hadn't yet been dragged into politics against his will. The house was a modest brick structure, nothing fancy, which fit Taylor's personality. He was a career military man, not an aristocrat. He didn't care about impressing people with architecture. Springfield was a working plantation with enslaved laborers growing crops. Taylor owned more than 100 people by the time he became president in 1849. He was a wealthy man, but his wealth came from land and slavery, not from salary. He'd spent 40 years in the Army moving around the country, so Springfield was his anchor, the place he planned to retire to once his service was done. He never made it. Taylor became president at age 64, served for 16 months, and died in July 1850 after attending a 4th of July celebration at the Washington Monument. He ate raw cherries and drank ice milk, got sick, and died 5 days later. The official cause was cholera morbus, or acute gastroenteritis. Modern historians think it might have been typhoid fever or contaminated food. Either way, he ate some cherries and died, which is a ridiculous end for a war hero. Taylor was buried in Louisville near Springfield. The plantation stayed in the family for a while, then passed through other owners. The house was eventually demolished. Today, the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery sits on part of the original property, but the house itself is gone. Springfield ranks low because it no longer exists, and because Taylor never retired there. He bought it as a dream for later, and later never came. But at least his death gave us the historical legacy of don't eat cherries at patriotic events, which is advice that stands the test of time. And speaking of presidents with forgettable legacies, let's talk about a man with a name that sounds made up. Millard Fillmore, Fillmore House. Millard Fillmore sounds like a fake name, and frankly, history treated him like a fake president. After his term ended in 1853, Fillmore returned to Buffalo, New York, and lived in a house on Franklin Street. It wasn't particularly grand. It was a modest 2-story structure, respectable but unremarkable, much like Fillmore himself. Fillmore had become president after Zachary Taylor died, and he spent his entire term trying not to make waves, which meant he made a lot of waves by signing the Fugitive Slave Act and basically ensuring that his own party wouldn't nominate him again. He left office unpopular and retired to Buffalo, where he kept a low profile and founded the Buffalo Historical Society, which is the kind of thing you do when you know history isn't going to remember you fondly. There's a persistent myth that Fillmore installed the first bathtub in the White House. This is false. The myth was invented by journalist H.L. Mencken in 1917 as a joke, and people believed it for decades. Fillmore had nothing to do with bathtubs. He wasn't even that into plumbing. But the myth stuck because people needed something, anything, to remember him by. Fillmore's Buffalo house was torn down long ago. He later moved to a larger mansion on Niagara Square, which also no longer exists. He remarried after his first wife died, lived comfortably, and spent his post-presidential years being aggressively mediocre. He ran for president again in 1856 on the Know Nothing Party ticket, which was an anti-immigrant nativist party, and lost badly. He died in Buffalo in 1874. The Fillmore house ranks low tier because it's gone, and because even when it existed, there was nothing special about it. But the bathtub myth is amusing, which counts for something. Not much, but something. And speaking of presidents who are remembered for the wrong reasons, the next one had a house full of tragedy. Franklin Pierce, Pierce Manse. Franklin Pierce bought the Pierce Manse in Concord, New Hampshire in 1842. It's a white, two-story Greek revival house with green shutters, modest by presidential standards, but comfortable. Pierce and his wife, Jane, lived there during the happiest years of their marriage, which is a low bar because their marriage was defined by grief and Jane's severe depression. Jane Pierce hated politics. She hated Washington. She fainted when she found out Pierce had been nominated for president in 1852. 2 months before his inauguration, their 11-year-old son, Benny, was killed in a train accident right in front of them. The train derailed. Benny was nearly decapitated. Pierce and Jane watched it happen. Jane never recovered. She spent Pierce's entire presidency in mourning, wearing black, writing letters to their dead son, and refusing to participate in any social functions. Pierce tried to govern while drowning in grief and guilt. He failed at both. His presidency was a disaster. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which led to violent conflict over slavery and basically set the stage for the Civil War. His own party didn't re-nominate him. He left office in 1857, one of the least popular presidents in history. Pierce and Jane returned to Concord, but not to the manse. They'd sold it years earlier. They lived in other houses, traveled to Europe, and drank heavily. Jane died in 1863. Pierce died in 1869, probably of cirrhosis. He's buried in Concord. The Pierce Manse was saved from demolition in 1966 and restored. It's now a house museum, and visitors can tour the rooms where the Pierces briefly lived before everything fell apart. The house ranks mid-tier for historical preservation, but low-tier for happiness, grief, and Greek revival. Name a sadder architectural combination. And if you thought that was depressing, the next president never even got married. James Buchanan, Wheatland. James Buchanan bought Wheatland in 1848, a 22-room federal-style brick mansion in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It sits on 22 acres and has the kind of symmetry that suggests a man who liked order but couldn't quite achieve it in his personal life. Buchanan was a lifelong bachelor, the only president who never married, and Wheatland reflects that. It's elegant but lonely, formal but empty. Buchanan had been engaged once, in 1819, to a woman named Anne Coleman. She broke off the engagement under unclear circumstances and died shortly afterward, possibly by suicide. Buchanan never courted anyone again. He lived with his niece, Harriet Lane, who served as his first lady during his presidency. At Wheatland, he entertained guests, hosted political meetings, and maintained the appearance of a successful statesman, but the house always felt like a stage set rather than a home. He retired to Wheatland after his presidency ended in 1861, just as the Civil War began. Buchanan's presidency is consistently ranked as one of the worst in American history. He failed to address the secession crisis. He dithered while the country split apart. He left office despised by both the North and the South, and he spent his retirement at Wheatland writing a memoir trying to defend his actions. No one was convinced. Buchanan died at Wheatland in 1868, The house stayed in private hands until 1936, when it was purchased by a foundation and turned into a museum. It's been carefully preserved, and you can tour it today. The rooms are elegant, the furnishings are expensive, and the whole place feels like a man trying very hard to convince you he made the right choices. Wheatland ranks decent for preservation, but it's hard to separate the house from the man, and the man's legacy is isolation and failure. The house is beautiful. The loneliness is palpable, but not every president lived alone. Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln Home. Abraham Lincoln bought a house at 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield, Illinois, in 1844 for $1,500. It's the only house he ever owned. The house was originally a 1.5-story Greek Revival cottage, modest but respectable. Over the years, Lincoln and his wife, Mary, expanded it to 2 full stories with 12 rooms as their family and income grew. The Lincolns lived there for 17 years. They raised their children there. Lincoln practiced law. Mary hosted social gatherings. They argued. They grieved. Their son Eddie died at age 3 in the house in 1850. The house witnessed ordinary life and extraordinary tragedy, often at the same time. The house wasn't grand. The furnishings were middle class. Lincoln wasn't wealthy. He earned a decent living as a lawyer, but he wasn't buying plantations or building mansions. The Springfield house reflected that. It was comfortable but unpretentious, which matched Lincoln's public image even if it didn't always match his ambition. Lincoln left Springfield in 1861 to become president, and he never returned. He was assassinated in April 1865. Mary moved out of the Springfield house, and it was eventually sold. Later, it was purchased and donated to the state of Illinois. In 1971, it became part of the Lincoln Home National Historic Site. Today, the house is preserved exactly as it looked in 1860, based on photographs, descriptions, and Mary Lincoln's inventory. You can visit and see where Lincoln read to his sons, where he received the news of his presidential nomination, and where he lived before everything changed. The Lincoln home ranks top tier for modesty and historical significance. It's not the grandest house on this list, but it's Lincoln's, and that carries weight. But not every post-Civil War president had such reverence. Andrew Johnson, Andrew Johnson House. Andrew Johnson's house in Greenville, Tennessee isn't grand. It's a simple 2-story brick structure that reflects Johnson's origins as a tailor before he stumbled into politics. Johnson never came from money. He was illiterate until his wife taught him to read and write. He worked his way up from absolute poverty to the vice presidency and then to the presidency after Lincoln's assassination. The house in Greenville was his anchor through all of it. Johnson bought the property in 1851, back when he was still a tailor and local politician. The house wasn't fancy then, and it still isn't. It has plain rooms, simple furnishings, and the kind of practical design that says, "I'm not here to impress you." Johnson lived there between political appointments, and he returned after his presidency ended in 1869. His presidency was a disaster. Johnson opposed Reconstruction efforts, fought constantly with Congress, and became the first president to be impeached. He survived removal by 1 vote in the Senate. He left office bitter and resentful, returned to Tennessee, and tried to rehabilitate his reputation. It didn't work. Johnson died in 1875 at his daughter's house, not at the Greenville home. He's buried in Greenville, and his house is now part of the Andrew Johnson National Historic Site. You can visit the house, the tailor shop he worked in, and his grave site, all preserved as reminders of a presidency defined by failure and obstruction. The Andrew Johnson House ranks low tier. It's historically significant because it shows his humble origins, but it's also a reminder that coming from nothing doesn't make you a good president. Johnson had somewhere to retreat after being impeached. which is more than he deserved. And speaking of presidents who struggled financially, the next one died broke despite being a war hero. Ulysses S. Grant. Grant Cottage and others. Ulysses S. Grant never really had one permanent home. He owned several houses over the years, lived in military housing, stayed with family, and generally moved around depending on where the army or politics sent him. But the place most associated with his final years is Grant Cottage in Wilton, New York, a modest mountain retreat where he went to die. By 1885, Grant was broke. After his presidency, he'd been swindled by a business partner in a financial scheme that wiped out his savings. He was dying of throat cancer, likely caused by years of cigar smoking. His family had no money, so Grant did the only thing he could. He wrote his memoirs. His friend Mark Twain convinced him to do it and agreed to publish them. Grant moved to Grant Cottage in June 1885, hoping the mountain air would ease his suffering. It didn't. He spent his final weeks writing furiously, racing against death to finish the book so his family would have something to live on. He finished the manuscript on July 19th. He died on July 23rd, 1885. The memoirs were a massive success, earning Grant's widow nearly $500,000 in royalties, which was a fortune at the time. Twain called them the best military memoirs ever written. Grant died broke but left his family secure. Grant Cottage still stands. It's a small, simple house with a porch where Grant sat wrapped in blankets, writing. It's now a National Historic Landmark. You can visit and see the chair where he died. Grant owned other properties, including a home in New York City and a farm in Missouri, but Grant Cottage is where his story ended. It ranks mid-tier for tragedy and redemption. The man saved the Union and died scrambling to save his family from poverty. But at least the next president had a stable retirement. Rutherford B. Hayes, Spiegel Grove. Rutherford B. Hayes' estate, Spiegel Grove, sits in Fremont, Ohio, on 25 acres of wooded land. The name Spiegel Grove comes from the German word for mirror, because Hayes' uncle, who originally owned the property, thought the reflection of trees in the small ponds on the land looked like mirrors. Hayes inherited the estate and built a large red brick Victorian mansion there in the 1850s. The house has 25 rooms, high ceilings, and wide verandas. Hayes expanded it over the years, adding wings and updating the interior. After his presidency ended in 1881, Hayes retired to Spiegel Grove and lived there for another 12 years. He didn't miss Washington. He spent his retirement advocating for prison reform, education, and veterans' rights. He planted trees, he read, he avoided drama. Hayes' wife, Lucy, was a teetotaler, and she banned alcohol in the White House during his presidency. This earned her the nickname Lemonade Lucy, which was meant as an insult, but she wore it proudly. At Spiegel Grove, the dry house policy continued. Guests drank lemonade and dealt with it. Hayes died at Spiegel Grove in January 1893 of a heart attack. He was 70 years old. The estate stayed in the family for decades. In 1910, Hayes' son turned part of the property into America's first presidential library. Today, Spiegel Grove is a museum and library complex, still filled with Hayes' papers, furnishings, and belongings. Spiegel Grove ranks mid to high tier. It's not flashy, but it's well preserved and historically significant. The house is comfortable, the legacy is respectable, and at least Hayes got to enjoy his retirement without going broke or dying immediately, which is more than we can say for the next president. James A. Garfield, Lawnfield. James A. Garfield bought a farmhouse in Mentor, Ohio in 1876. He called it Lawnfield, though that name came later from reporters who noticed he kept giving speeches from the front porch. The house was originally a 9-room farmhouse, modest and practical. Garfield expanded it to 20 rooms, adding a library wing and a second floor. He needed space for his 7 children and his massive book collection, because Garfield was the kind of person who read Greek and Latin for fun. Lawnfield is where Garfield conducted his 1880 presidential campaign. He literally stood on his front porch and gave speeches to crowds who traveled to Ohio to hear him. This was called a front porch campaign, and it became a trend. Why travel the country when people can come to you? Garfield thought it was practical. His neighbors probably thought it was annoying. He won the election, moved to Washington, and was shot 4 months later by a disappointed office seeker named Charles Guiteau. Garfield didn't die immediately. He lingered for 2.5 months while doctors repeatedly stuck their unwashed fingers into the bullet wound trying to find the bullet. He probably died of infection, not the gunshot. Medical incompetence and hubris killed him in September 1881. Garfield never retired to Lawnfield. His wife, Lucretia, returned there after his death and lived in the house for another 37 years. She added a memorial library wing in 1886 to house Garfield's papers and books. The house became a shrine to a presidency that lasted less than a year. Today, Lawnfield is part of the James A. Garfield National Historic Site. You can visit the porch where he campaigned, the library where he read, and the rooms his family lived in after he was gone. The house ranks mid-tier for preservation and tragedy. Great porch. Terrible timing. Garfield had big plans for his retirement, and he got none of them. But at least he had a house to not come home to. The next president's house doesn't exist anymore. Chester A. Arthur, Lexington's Avenue, Brownstone, Chester A. Arthur lived in a 4-story brownstone at 123 Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. It was elegant, fashionable, and located in the right neighborhood for a man who owned 80 pairs of pants and changed his clothes multiple times a day. Arthur was the most stylish president in American history, and his house reflected that. High ceilings, custom furniture, imported rugs, and the kind of interior design that screamed, "I care deeply about aesthetics and not at all about your opinion." Arthur became president after Garfield was assassinated in 1881. No one expected much from him. He'd been a political hack, a product of the spoils system, chosen as vice president to balance the ticket. Then Garfield died, and Arthur suddenly had to be a real president. Shockingly, he did a decent job. He reformed civil service, vetoed pork barrel spending, and generally acted like someone who took the job seriously. People were confused. Arthur never married after his wife, Ellen, died in 1880 in January, a year before he became president. He kept fresh flowers next to her photograph in the White House every single day. At the Lexington Avenue brownstone, he'd hosted dinners, entertained friends, and lived comfortably. After his presidency ended in 1885, he returned to New York and lived quietly in the brownstone until he died of kidney disease in November 1886. He was 57. The brownstone was demolished in 1903. There's an apartment building there now. No marker, no plaque, nothing. Chester A. Arthur, the president who surprised everyone by being competent, has no surviving home. His legacy is 80 pairs of pants, civil service reform, and a demolished brownstone. The house ranks low because it no longer exists, but Arthur himself ranks higher than expected. Style over substance? Sure. But at least he had style. And the substance wasn't bad either, which almost no one saw coming. And speaking of unexpected competence, the next president served 2 non-consecutive terms, which means we have to talk about him now and also later. Lucky us. Grover Cleveland, Westland Mansion. Grover Cleveland is the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, which means he's both the 22nd and 24th president. This is confusing and annoying, but it does mean we only have to discuss his house once. Westland Mansion sits in Princeton, New Jersey, and Cleveland bought it in 1900, 4 years after his second presidency ended. It's a large, sprawling Victorian house with the multiple additions, wide porches, and the kind of rambling layout that suggests no one really had a plan. Cleveland had been living in New York City after leaving office, but he wanted something quieter. He chose Princeton, bought Westland, and settled in with his wife, Frances, who was 27 years younger than him. They'd met when she was an infant. He was her legal guardian after her father died. Then he married her when she was 21 and he was 49, which is deeply uncomfortable no matter how you frame it. They had 5 children together, and Westland was where they raised them. Cleveland spent his post-presidential years at Westland writing, fishing, and serving as a trustee of Princeton University. He gave lectures. He avoided politics. He gained weight. He developed health problems. He died at Westland in June 1908 of a heart attack and kidney failure. He was 71. Frances stayed at Westland for a few years, then remarried and moved. The house was eventually sold, passed through several owners, and still stands today as a private residence. It's not open to the public. You can't tour it. It's just there, quietly existing in Princeton like Cleveland's legacy, competent, forgettable, and vaguely uncomfortable if you think about it too long. Westland ranks mid-tier. It's preserved, but inaccessible. It housed a president twice, technically, but only once physically. The house is fine. The legacy is fine. Everything about Grover Cleveland is fine, which is the most damning thing you can say about a president. But before Cleveland's second term, there was another Harrison. And yes, it's confusing. Benjamin Harrison House. Benjamin Harrison lived in a 2.5-story brick Italianate house in Indianapolis, Indiana. He built it in 1875, back when he was a lawyer, long before he became president. The house has 16 rooms, 10-foot ceilings, and the kind of Victorian clutter that makes you claustrophobic just thinking about it. Lots of wallpaper, heavy drapes, dark wood, and furniture that looks expensive but deeply uncomfortable. Harrison was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the president who died after 31 days in office from cherries or pneumonia or medical malpractice, depending on who you ask. Benjamin Harrison had a better survival rate. He served a full term from 1889 to 1893, lost re-election to Grover Cleveland in a rematch, and returned to Indianapolis. The house was where Harrison practiced law, raised his children, and conducted his 1888 front porch campaign. Yes, another front porch campaign. Apparently, standing on your porch and making speeches was peak political strategy in the late 1800s. Harrison won, served one term, and came back to the same house. One interesting detail: the Harrisons were among the first families to have electricity installed in the White House, but they were terrified of it. They reportedly refused to touch the light switches because they thought they'd get electrocuted. Staff had to turn the lights on and off for them. This feels like a metaphor for Harrison's presidency: new technology, old anxieties, and a general sense of not wanting to touch anything. Harrison died at the Indianapolis house in March 1901 of pneumonia. The house stayed in the family, then was purchased by the Arthur Jordan Foundation in 1937 and turned into a museum. It's been carefully preserved with original furnishings, wallpaper, and that distinct Victorian gloom. The Benjamin Harrison house ranks mid-tier. It's well preserved and historically significant, but it's also overshadowed by the fact that his grandfather was more famous for dying quickly than Benjamin was for actually governing. But at least Harrison finished his term. The next president wasn't so lucky. William McKinley, McKinley House. William McKinley lived in a two-story frame house on North Market Street in Canton, Ohio. He bought it in 1878, and it was a comfortable middle-class home, nothing extravagant. McKinley wasn't wealthy. He was a lawyer and politician who lived modestly, at least by presidential standards. The house had a front porch, which you've probably guessed by now means he ran a front porch campaign. In 1896, McKinley stood on that porch and gave speeches to over 750,000 people who traveled to Canton to hear him. The neighbors must have been thrilled. McKinley won the presidency and served from 1897 until 1901, when he was shot by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. McKinley survived for 8 days, during which doctors once again proved that confidence and hygiene are not the same thing. He died of gangrene from the infected bullet wound on September 14, 1901. Another president killed by medical incompetence as much as the bullet. McKinley never retired to his Canton home. His wife, Ida, who suffered from epilepsy and severe anxiety, returned to Canton and lived there until her death in 1907. The house was torn down in 1937, which seems disrespectful, but was apparently necessary for a parking lot, or something equally important. Today, there's the McKinley National Memorial in Canton, a large monument where McKinley and Ida are buried. The house is gone, but the memorial remains. There's also the McKinley Presidential Library and Museum nearby, which preserves his papers and artifacts. But the actual house, gone. The McKinley house ranks low because it no longer exists. Another front porch campaign house lost to time and urban development. McKinley deserved better, but at least he got a very large memorial, which probably would have embarrassed him. He was a modest man. His house reflected that. And now it's a memory. But the next president was anything but modest. Theodore Roosevelt, Sagamore Hill. Theodore Roosevelt's house, Sagamore Hill, sits on Cove Neck in Oyster Bay, New York, overlooking Long Island Sound. Roosevelt built it in 1885 as a wedding gift for his second wife, Edith, after his first wife died. The house is massive, rambling, and chaotic, which perfectly matches Roosevelt's personality. It has 23 rooms, wide verandas, a gun room, a trophy room filled with mounted animal heads, and enough energy to exhaust you just by walking through it. Roosevelt loved Sagamore Hill. He called it his summer White House during his presidency and spent as much time there as possible. The house was always full of people. His 6 children ran wild. Guests came and went. There were picnics, hikes, tennis matches, swimming in the Sound, and Roosevelt holding court on every topic imaginable. He once said, "I can be president of the United States, or I can control Alice," referring to his eldest daughter, who was as unmanageable as he was energetic. He chose the presidency. After leaving office in 1909, Roosevelt lived at Sagamore Hill until his death in January 1919. He died in his sleep at age 60, which shocked everyone because it seemed impossible that Theodore Roosevelt could do anything quietly. The house stayed in the family until 1963, when it was donated to the National Park Service. Today, Sagamore Hill is a National Historic Site. You can tour the house, see the mounted animals, the books, the artifacts from Roosevelt's travels, and feel the sheer exhausting vitality of the place. It's like walking into a 3-dimensional embodiment of Roosevelt's personality. Loud, expansive, and relentlessly enthusiastic. Sagamore Hill ranks top tier for energy and preservation. It's not subtle, it's not modest, it's Roosevelt, and that's the point. Visiting it is exhausting, but in the best possible way. But after all that energy, the next president offered something completely different. Girth. William Howard Taft. Taft House. William Howard Taft was born in a 2.5-story Greek revival house in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1857. The house was built in 1851 and belonged to Taft's parents. Taft grew up there, left for college and his legal career, and eventually returned after his presidency to live in the area. The house itself is modest, with high ceilings, simple rooms, and the kind of understated elegance that suggests middle class respectability. Taft is famous for two things: being the largest president in American history, weighing over 300 pounds, and getting stuck in the White House bathtub, which is a myth but persists because people love the image. He wasn't stuck. The bathtub was just regular sized, and he was not. They installed a larger one. The end. Taft's presidency from 1909 to 1913 was fine. Not great, not terrible, just fine. He lost re-election to Woodrow Wilson, which devastated him more than you'd think, because Taft didn't really want to be president in the first place. He wanted to be a judge. He got his wish in 1921 when President Warren Harding appointed him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Taft was much happier there. Taft didn't retire to his Cincinnati birthplace. After his presidency, he lived in Washington, D.C., and served on the Supreme Court until his death in March 1930. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery, the first president buried there. The Cincinnati house remained in the family for a while, then passed through other owners before being preserved as a National Historic Site in the 1960s. The Taft House ranks mid-tier. It's well preserved and represents his early life, but it's not where he lived during his most important years. Still, it's there, which is more than some presidents can say. And the bathtub myth adds a certain charm, even if it's completely false. But speaking of myths, the next president had enough real scandals that he didn't need any. Woodrow Wilson House. Woodrow Wilson's the only president who retired and stayed in Washington, D.C. Most presidents couldn't wait to leave. Wilson bought a townhouse at 2340 S Street, NW, in 1921, right after his presidency ended. It's a 3-story Georgian Revival brick house in the Kalorama neighborhood, which was and still is one of the nicest areas in the city. Wilson picked it because his second wife, Edith, liked it. Edith had basically been running the country for the last year and a half of Wilson's presidency after he had a massive stroke in October 1919, so she'd earned the right to choose the house. Wilson was physically broken when he left office. The stroke left him partially paralyzed, nearly blind in one eye, and mentally diminished. He'd spent the last years of his presidency fighting for the League of Nations, watching it fail in the Senate, and collapsing under the weight of his own stubbornness and declining health. Moving to S Street was less a retirement and more a slow decline. The house has 8 bedrooms, high ceilings, a library, and a billiard room. Wilson installed an elevator because he couldn't manage stairs. He spent his final years reading when he could, receiving visitors, and watching the world move on without him. He died in the house in February 1924, just 3 years after moving in. Edith stayed in the house until her death in 1961. She preserved everything exactly as Wilson left it. After she died, the house was donated to the National Trust for Historic Preservation and opened as a museum. It's still filled with Wilson's books, furniture, and artifacts from his presidency. The Woodrow Wilson House ranks mid-tier for historical significance, but high for sadness. It's a beautiful house where a broken man spent his final years regretting the League of Nations and mortality. Stuffy, like his foreign policy, and somehow still standing. But if you thought Wilson's retirement was sad, the next president barely got one at all. Warren G. Harding's house sits in Marion, Ohio, a 2-story green Queen Anne-style home with a wraparound porch. Harding bought it in 1891, back when he was a newspaper editor and before he stumbled into politics through a combination of charm, good looks, and profoundly poor judgment. The house has 14 rooms, ornate woodwork, and the kind of Victorian details that suggest someone cared about appearances. Harding lived in the Marion House throughout his political rise. He was elected to the Senate, then ran for president in 1920. Like McKinley and Harrison before him, Harding conducted a front porch campaign from his Marion home. Apparently, Ohio politicians really loved their porches. He won the election, served as president from 1921 until August 1923, and died suddenly in San Francisco during a cross-country tour. The official cause was a heart attack. Some historians think it was a stroke. Conspiracy theorists think his wife poisoned him. No one knows for sure because there was no autopsy. What we do know is that Harding's presidency was riddled with scandals. The Teapot Dome scandal, corruption, affairs. Harding had at least 2 long-term mistresses, one of whom he met with in a White House closet. His administration was a mess. He died before most of it came to light, which was probably a mercy. Harding never retired to his Marion home. His wife, Florence, returned there after his death and burned most of his papers, presumably to protect his reputation. It didn't work. The house was eventually donated to the state of Ohio and turned into a museum. You can tour it today and see where Harding lived, worked, and made terrible decisions. The Harding home ranks mid-tier for preservation, low-tier for legacy. Nice house. Terrible judgment. The porch is historically significant. The man is historically embarrassing. But at least the next president was the opposite. Quiet, honest, and deeply boring. Calvin Coolidge. The Homestead. Calvin Coolidge was born in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, in a small wooden cottage attached to a general store. His father owned the store, and the family lived modestly in the rooms above and behind it. The house is tiny, plain, and very Vermont. No frills, no pretense, just functional rural life in the late 1800s. The most famous moment in the house's history happened in August 1923. Coolidge was vice president, visiting his father in Vermont, when he received word that President Warren G. Harding had died. There was no electricity in Plymouth Notch. Coolidge's father, a notary public, administered the presidential oath of office by kerosene lamp in the family sitting room at 2:47 a.m. on August 3rd. Coolidge was sworn in, went back to bed, and traveled to Washington the next morning. The whole thing was deeply Coolidge. Quiet, efficient, and almost comically understated. Coolidge served as president until 1929, chose not to run for re-election, and retired to Northampton, Massachusetts, where he and his wife had lived for years. He didn't return to the Vermont homestead permanently. He visited occasionally, but he was a Massachusetts man by then. Coolidge died in January 1933 of a heart attack. He was 60 years old. The Plymouth Notch homestead remained in the Coolidge family and is now part of the President Calvin Coolidge State Historic Site. The entire village is preserved, including the store, the house, the church, and the cemetery where Coolidge is buried. It's one of the most authentic presidential sites in the country. The homestead ranks high for authenticity and simplicity. It's not grand, it's not impressive, it's just real. Silent Cal came from a silent village, and both are still there, frozen in time and perfectly preserved. Like the man himself, understated, honest, and a little boring. But the quiet wouldn't last. The next decade brought economic collapse and a very different kind of president. Herbert Hoover, Henry Hoover House. Herbert Hoover's house sits on the Stanford University campus in Palo Alto, California. He and his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, built it in 1919, right after World War I, when Hoover was an international hero for his humanitarian relief work. The house is a sprawling 2-story Pueblo revival-style structure with flat roofs, earth-toned stucco, and the kind of architectural optimism that screams, "Everything is going to be fine forever." Narrator voice, "Everything was not fine forever." The house has multiple wings, courtyards, and around 20 rooms. Lou Henry Hoover was deeply involved in the design. She studied geology at Stanford, the first woman to earn a degree in that field there, and she had strong opinions about how houses should work. The layout is open and informal by 1920 standards, with lots of natural light and indoor-outdoor flow. It's actually quite beautiful, which makes what happened next even more tragic. Hoover became president in 1929. The stock market crashed 8 months later. The Great Depression began. Hoover tried to fix it using volunteerism, optimism, and the firm belief that the economy would correct itself if everyone just had faith in capitalism. It did not correct itself. Millions lost their jobs. Banks failed. Shanty towns called Hoovervilles sprang up across the country. Hoover's name became synonymous with failure and suffering, which was deeply unfair given his earlier humanitarian work, but history doesn't care about fairness. Hoover lost the 1932 election to Franklin D. Roosevelt in a landslide. He retired to Palo Alto, lived in the house on and off, and spent the next 30 years writing books, giving speeches, and trying to rehabilitate his reputation. He outlived most of his critics. He died in October 1964 at age 90 in New York City, not at the Palo Alto house. Lou had died in 1944. After Hoover's death, the house was donated to Stanford University. It's now the official residence of Stanford's president, which means it's still being used, still beautiful, and still a reminder that good intentions and bad timing can destroy a legacy. The house ranks high for design and preservation, but it's impossible to separate it from the context of the Depression. Great house, unfortunate timing. A recurring theme at this point. The architecture was optimistic. The economy was not. And Hoover spent 3 decades trying to explain the difference. But the next president didn't just inherit an economy in collapse. He also inherited a house with history. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Springwood. Franklin D. Roosevelt's estate, Springwood, sits in Hyde Park, New York, overlooking the Hudson River. The house was built in 1826, but Roosevelt's father bought it in 1867 and expanded it over the years. FDR was born there in 1882, grew up there, inherited it, and made it his primary residence for his entire life. He called it home even while serving as president for 12 years, longer than anyone before or since. Springwood is a 2.5-story stucco-covered brick mansion with cream-colored walls, a columned portico, and about 40 rooms after all the expansions. Roosevelt loved the place obsessively. He oversaw every renovation, every landscaping decision, every tree planting. He designed the presidential library that was built on the property in 1941, the first presidential library in the country. He wanted to be buried there, and he was. The house became known as the Summer White House because Roosevelt spent so much time there during his presidency. He entertained heads of state, including Winston Churchill, who visited multiple times. There's a famous story about Churchill staying at Springwood and being scandalized by the casual informality of it all. Roosevelt served hot dogs to the King and Queen of England during a 1939 visit. Hot dogs to royalty at a presidential estate. The audacity. Roosevelt also had the house modified for accessibility after polio left him unable to walk without assistance. There were ramps, an elevator, and door handles positioned for wheelchair access. He never publicly acknowledged the extent of his disability, but at Springwood he didn't have to hide it. The house was designed around his needs. Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia, in April 1945. Not at Springwood, but his body was brought back and buried in the Rose Garden, exactly where he wanted. His wife, Eleanor, is buried next to him. The estate was donated to the federal government and is now the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt National Historic Site. Springwood ranks top tier. It's historically significant, beautifully preserved, and intimately connected to 12 years of American history. The house witnessed the New Deal, World War II, and FDR's 4 terms. It's also a reminder that even presidents in wheelchairs can serve hot dogs to kings and get away with it. The house is grand but welcoming. The legacy is complicated but undeniable, and the rose garden is still there, quietly holding two of the most important people of the 20th century. But the next president preferred something much simpler. Harry S. Truman. Truman Home. Harry Truman's house sits at 219 North Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri. It's a 2.5-story white Victorian house with 14 rooms, a wraparound porch, and absolutely no pretension. Truman didn't own the house. It belonged to his wife Bess's family, the Wallaces. Truman married Bess in 1919, moved into the house with her and her mother, and lived there for the rest of his life. Yes, Truman, who became president, lived with his mother-in-law for decades. Yeah, the house was built in 1867 and has the kind of modest, middle-class charm that Midwestern families loved in the late 19th century. High ceilings, simple woodwork, comfortable rooms, nothing fancy. Truman added a porch and made some updates over the years, but mostly he just lived there like a normal person, which he insisted he was. Despite becoming president after Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945. Truman served as president from 1945 to 1953. He dropped atomic bombs on Japan, desegregated the military, fought the Korean War, and dealt with the beginning of the Cold War. Then he went home to independence, moved back into the Wallace house with Bess, and resumed his life as a regular Midwestern retiree. He took walks every morning. He answered his own mail. He argued with people who criticized his daughter's singing career. He was shockingly normal for someone who had reshaped the world. The Secret Service was not thrilled with the arrangement. The house had no security features. It was right on a public street. Neighbors could walk by and wave at the former president sitting on his porch, and they did. Truman didn't care. He liked being accessible. He liked independence. He liked his life. Truman died at a Kansas City hospital in December 1972. He was 88. Bess stayed in the house until her death in 1982 at age 97. She'd lived in that house for most of her life. After her death, the house was turned over to the National Park Service and is now the Harry S. Truman National Historic Site. The Truman home ranks high for authenticity and humility. It's not grand. It's not impressive. It's just a normal house where a very normal man lived before, during, and after being president. The fact that he lived with his mother-in-law the whole time makes it even more relatable. Truman was the people's president, and the house proves it. But not every post-war president was so humble. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Eisenhower Farm. Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't own a home until he was 59 years old. He'd spent his entire adult life in the military, moving from base to base, living in government housing. In 1950, while serving as president of Columbia University, Eisenhower bought a farm near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was the first and only home he ever owned. The property included a farmhouse, 189 acres, and a view of the Gettysburg battlefield, which probably appealed to Eisenhower's sense of history and drama. The farmhouse was old and needed work. Eisenhower and his wife, Mamie, renovated it extensively, turning it into a comfortable, sprawling ranch-style home with modern amenities. They added a glassed-in porch, updated the kitchen, and decorated with a mix of military memorabilia and personal touches. Mamie was in charge of the interior, and she filled it with the kind of 1950s cheerfulness that included pink bathrooms and floral wallpaper. Eisenhower focused on the farm itself, raising cattle and trying to prove he could be a gentleman farmer, which he could not. Eisenhower used the farm as a retreat during his presidency from 1953 to 1961. He entertained world leaders there, including Nikita Khrushchev, which must have been surreal. Welcome to my farm, Mr. Soviet Premier. Would you like to see the cattle? The farm became a kind of informal Camp David before Camp David, a place where Eisenhower could relax, play golf, and pretend he wasn't managing the Cold War. After leaving office, Eisenhower retired to the Gettysburg farm full time. He lived there for 8 years, writing his memoirs, painting, and enjoying the only permanent home he'd ever known. He died at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in March 1969, but he's buried in Abilene, Kansas, his childhood hometown. Mamie stayed at the farm until 1979, when she donated it to the National Park Service. It's now the Eisenhower National Historic Site, preserved exactly as it looked in the 1960s. You can tour the house, see Eisenhower's paintings, and visit the farm where a five-star general tried and failed to be a farmer. The Eisenhower farm ranks high for historical significance and modest charm. It's not grand, but it's genuine. A general's modest retreat, finally. And the pink bathrooms are unforgettable, which Mamie would have appreciated, but modest retreats were about to become much less common. John F. Kennedy, Kennedy Compound. The Kennedy Compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, isn't one house. It's 3 houses on 6 acres overlooking Nantucket Sound. Joseph P. Kennedy, JFK's father, bought the main house in 1928. Over the years, he bought adjacent properties for his children. By the time John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, the compound had become the unofficial summer White House and the physical embodiment of American political royalty. The main house is a large, white, clapboard New England structure with green shutters, wraparound porches, and stunning water views. It's elegant but not ostentatious, which is a lie because everything about the Kennedys was ostentatious. They just had good taste while doing it. The compound was where the family gathered for holidays, sailed, played touch football, and crafted the mythology of Camelot. Journalists loved it. Photographers loved it. The public loved it. It was perfect. Kennedy spent as much time as possible at Hyannisport during his presidency. He worked from there, met with advisors, and used the compound as a retreat from Washington's pressures. The house was filled with children, dogs, relatives, and the constant motion of a large, ambitious, chaotic family. It looked idyllic in photographs, which was the point. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, and the compound became a place of mourning. The family continued to use it, but it was never quite the same. Tragedy after tragedy hit the Kennedys over the decades. The compound witnessed it all. Today, the compound remains in the Kennedy family. It's private, you can't tour it. You can drive by and see it from the road, but that's it. The main house and property are still used by Kennedy descendants. It's one of the few presidential homes that remains a functional family residence rather than a museum, which makes sense. The Kennedys are still a dynasty, still ambitious, still crafting their image. The Kennedy compound ranks high for iconic status. But there's a question underneath. Is it a home or a brand? The answer is probably both. The house is beautiful. The location is stunning. The legacy is complicated, and the whole thing feels like a performance, which is very Kennedy. They understood that image matters. The compound was their stage, and they played their parts perfectly. But not every president needed a compound to feel important. Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ Ranch. Lyndon B. Johnson's ranch sits along the Pedernales River in the Texas Hill Country, about 60 miles west of Austin. Johnson bought the property in 1951, though his family had roots in the area going back generations. The ranch house itself is a modest, one-story limestone structure that Johnson expanded over the years into a sprawling complex of buildings, guest houses, and working ranch operations. Johnson called it the Texas White House during his presidency, and he meant it. He conducted official business there, held meetings, entertained foreign leaders, and forced everyone to take tours of the property whether they wanted to or not. Johnson was deeply proud of his Texas roots, and the ranch was his way of proving he was still a country boy despite running the country. He wore cowboy hats, drove visitors around in his Lincoln Continental, and famously owned an amphicar, a car that could drive into the river and float. He loved terrifying guests by driving toward the water and pretending the brakes had failed. The ranch was a working cattle operation, and Johnson took it seriously. He checked on the cattle daily, oversaw the operations, and genuinely loved being a rancher. It wasn't just a hobby or a photo opportunity. He cared about the land, even as his presidency was consumed by the Vietnam War and civil rights struggles. Johnson died at the ranch in January 1973 of a heart attack. He was 64. He's buried in the family cemetery on the property. His wife, Lady Bird Johnson, stayed at the ranch until her death in 2007. After her death, the property was fully transferred to the National Park Service, and it's now the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park. You can tour the ranch today, see the house, the amphicar, the cemetery, and the airstrip Johnson installed so he could fly in and out whenever he wanted. The ranch ranks high for authenticity and personality. It's pure LBJ, big, ambitious, exhausting, and deeply Texan. The man had a larger-than-life personality, and the ranch reflects that. It's also a working ranch, which adds a layer of legitimacy that some presidential estates lack. Johnson wasn't playing at being a cowboy. He was one, even while he was president. And the amphicar story alone makes it worth visiting. But after Johnson, the next president preferred a California beach over a Texas ranch. Richard Nixon, La Casa Pacifica. Richard Nixon bought La Casa Pacifica in San Clemente, California in 1969, right after becoming president. The property sits on 25 acres overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and the estate includes a 9-bedroom Spanish colonial revival mansion with red tile roofs, white stucco walls, and sweeping ocean views. Nixon called it the Western White House, and he spent more than a quarter of his presidency there, which tells you how much he wanted to avoid Washington. The house itself is beautiful. It's elegant, private, and meticulously maintained. Nixon bought it with financial help from friends, which later became a minor scandal because everything Nixon did became a scandal eventually. He installed a helicopter pad, upgraded security, and added a small office complex where he could work while pretending he was on vacation. The estate became a retreat where Nixon could think, plan, and avoid the press. La Casa Pacifica was where Nixon spent the final days of his presidency. In August 1974, as the Watergate scandal consumed his administration and impeachment became inevitable, Nixon flew to San Clemente and resigned from there. He gave his resignation speech on August 8th, and the next day he left the White House for good. He returned to La Casa Pacifica, no longer president, just a disgraced man with a beautiful house and a broken legacy. Nixon lived there until 1980, when he sold the property and moved to New York, then later to New Jersey. He spent the rest of his life trying to rehabilitate his image, writing books, giving speeches, and positioning himself as an elder statesman. It worked, to some extent. He died in April 1994. La Casa Pacifica remains a private residence. You cannot visit it. You cannot tour it. It's just there, on the cliffs above the ocean, a monument to ambition and paranoia. The house ranks high for location and architecture, but terrible for vibes. It's where a presidency died. You can feel the paranoia in the walls, even from the outside. Nixon wanted privacy, and he got it, but the cost was everything else. Great location, terrible memories, and somehow still standing. But at least the next president was nice. Gerald Ford, Gerald R. Ford Residences. Gerald Ford never really had one permanent presidential retirement home, which fits his accidental presidency perfectly. Ford was a congressman from Michigan who became vice president when Spiro Agnew resigned, then became president when Nixon resigned. He was the only president never elected to either position, and he handled it with the kind of genial competence that made people like him even when they didn't agree with him. Ford owned a house in Alexandria, Virginia, while serving in Congress, but after his presidency ended in 1977, he and his wife Betty moved to Rancho Mirage, California. They built a house there in the desert, a modern, comfortable retreat where they could play golf, entertain friends, and enjoy the warm weather. The house was private, modest by presidential standards, and perfectly suited to Ford's unpretentious personality. Ford also kept a condo in Vail, Colorado, where he loved to ski. He was an excellent athlete, despite his reputation for clumsiness, which was largely invented by Saturday Night Live and Chevy Chase's impression of him falling down constantly. Ford was actually graceful and coordinated. He played football at the University of Michigan. He skied well into his 80s. The man was fit. Ford lived in Rancho Mirage for 29 years, the longest retirement of any president at that point. He wrote his memoirs, gave speeches, served on corporate boards, and stayed active in Republican politics without being overbearing. He died in December 2006 at age 93 at his Rancho Mirage home. Betty died in 2011. The houses Ford lived in aren't museums. They're private. The Rancho Mirage house was sold. The Vail condo isn't open to the public. Ford's presidential library is in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but his homes are just gone, absorbed back into normal life, which seems appropriate. Ford was the accidental president, and his homes reflect that. Nice, comfortable, and ultimately forgettable. He deserved better, but he probably wouldn't have minded. Ford was never about legacy. He was about doing the job and moving on. Nice houses for a nice guy nobody elected, but the next president was elected, and his legacy is anything but forgettable. Jimmy Carter, Carter Family Compound. Jimmy Carter lives in Plains, Georgia, in a modest one-story ranch house that he and his wife Rosalind built in 1961 for $60,000. It's a small town, population about 700, and Carter has lived there his entire life except for his 4 years as president from 1977 to 1981, and his time as governor of Georgia before that. The house is simple. Red brick, green shutters, about 2,000 square feet. It's the most humble presidential residence on this list, and it's not even close. Carter didn't buy a grand estate after leaving office. He went home to Plains, to the house he'd always lived in. He and Rosalind became the town's most famous residents, but they never acted like it. Carter taught Sunday school at Maranatha Baptist Church for decades. He built houses with Habitat for Humanity well into his 90s. He wrote books, more than 30 of them. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. He outlived every other president of his generation. And he did it all from a small house in a small town in rural Georgia. The house is surrounded by Secret Service, of course. There's a security perimeter, fencing, and all the apparatus that comes with protecting a former president. But otherwise, it's just a house. You can't tour it. It's private. Carter still lives there as of this script's writing, the longest-lived president in American history. Rosalind died in November 2023, and Carter has remained in Plains. The Carter compound ranks top tier for humility and authenticity. No other president lived so modestly after leaving office. No other president stayed so rooted in their hometown. Carter's house is a rebuke to every mansion, every estate, every compound on this list. It says, You don't need grandeur to matter. You don't need a sprawling property to leave a legacy. You just need to show up, do the work, and build houses for people who need them. The house is modest. The man is extraordinary. And the fact that he's still there, still in Plains, still in that same ranch house is both humbling and inspiring. Carter's legacy isn't the house, it's what he did after he left the White House. But the house represents all of it: humility, service, and an absolute refusal to be anything other than who he always was. But after Carter came a very different kind of president: Ronald Reagan, Rancho del Cielo. Ronald Reagan's ranch, Rancho del Cielo, sits in the mountains above Santa Barbara, California. Reagan bought the property in 1974 for $527,000, back when he was between his terms as governor of California and his presidency. The ranch covers 688 acres, and the house itself is a small, rustic adobe structure with about 1,500 square feet, 4 rooms, and no pretension whatsoever. Reagan loved the ranch obsessively. He called it the ranch, or Rancho del Cielo, which means ranch in the sky. He spent as much time there as possible during his presidency from 1981 to 1989. He cleared brush, mended fences, rode horses, and chopped wood, which became iconic images of Reagan as the rugged Western president. He wasn't faking it. Reagan genuinely loved manual labor and being outdoors. The ranch was where he felt most himself. Reagan entertained world leaders at the ranch, including Mikhail Gorbachev, Queen Elizabeth II, and Margaret Thatcher. He'd bring them to this tiny adobe house in the mountains and serve them barbecue. It was a power move disguised as informality. Yes, I'm the leader of the free world, and I'm serving you hot dogs on a paper plate in the mountains. It worked. People loved it. Reagan's second wife, Nancy, tolerated the ranch but didn't love it. She preferred Los Angeles, shopping, and civilization. Reagan preferred solitude, horses, and jelly beans, which he kept in a jar on the counter. After his presidency ended, Reagan spent less time at the ranch as Alzheimer's disease progressed. He last visited in 1995. He died in 2004. The ranch was sold to the Young America's Foundation in 1998, and it's been preserved as a museum and education center. You can tour it by appointment. The house is exactly as Reagan left it: simple, rustic, and filled with Western memorabilia. Rancho del Cielo ranks high for charm and authenticity. It's not grand, it's not luxurious. It's a working ranch where a president found peace. The house is small, but the views are endless. The image is iconic, and the jelly beans are still there, which feels very Reagan: charming, nostalgic, and very on brand. But after the California ranch, the next president preferred a New England coastline. George H.W. Bush, Walker's Point. George H.W. Bush's family compound, Walker's Point, sits on a rocky peninsula in Kennebunkport, Maine, jutting into the Atlantic Ocean like a declaration of old money and older traditions. The property has been in Bush's family since 1896, when his maternal great-grandfather, George Herbert Walker, bought it. That's right. Bush's middle initial doesn't stand for Herbert because his parents were creative. It stands for Herbert because that's how WASP families work. You inherit names, money, and oceanfront property, and you're grateful for all three. The main house is a large, sprawling, weathered shingle structure with multiple additions, wide porches, and ocean views that scream, "We've been summering in New England since before summering was a verb." The house has 11 bedrooms, multiple living areas, and the kind of comfortable, worn-in elegance that only comes from generations of use. Nothing is new. Nothing needs to be. The furniture has been there since the 1930s. The same paintings hang on the same walls. Change is for people who don't have compounds. Bush spent summers at Walker's Point throughout his childhood, playing on the rocks, sailing in the harbor, and learning the unspoken rules of New England WASP culture: be modest, be polite, and never, ever discuss money. After his presidency ended in 1993, he and his wife Barbara made it their primary summer residence. The house became Bush's refuge, the place where he could be himself without the weight of public office. He loved it obsessively. Walker's Point is classic New England coastal, comfortable, unpretentious by rich people standards, and designed for sailing, swimming, and pretending you're related to the Mayflower Pilgrims, even if you're technically not. Bush loved boating, fishing, and speeding around in his cigarette boat, Fidelity, which he continued doing well into his 80s because adrenaline doesn't care about age or presidential dignity. He'd zip across the harbor, Secret Service scrambling to keep up, grinning like a teenager. It was the most human thing about him. Walker's Point became the Summer White House during Bush's presidency from 1989 to 1993. He entertained foreign leaders there, held meetings, and famously hosted Mikhail Gorbachev for a summit in 1990. The sight of the Soviet premier awkwardly standing on a main dock while Bush showed off his boat was peak end of Cold War absurdity. Bush also conducted his 1988 presidential campaign partly from Walker's Point, because apparently Maine is a great place to run for president if you already have name recognition and family money. After losing re-election to Bill Clinton in 1992, Bush retired to Walker's Point and Houston, Texas, splitting time between the two. He remained active in public life, jumped out of airplanes for his birthday multiple times, and became close friends with Clinton, which confused everyone but was oddly heartwarming. Bush died in November 2018 at age 94. Walker's Point remains in the Bush family. It's private. You can't tour it, but you can take boat tours around Kennebunkport and see it from the water, which feels appropriately voyeuristic and New England. The house ranks high for history and WASP authenticity. It's not flashy, it's just old money, old house, old traditions. Bush belonged to a different era of American politics, and Walker's Point represents that: respectable, patrician, and comfortable, in a way that doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. But the next president was decidedly not old money. Bill Clinton, Clinton House. Bill Clinton bought a house in Chappaqua, New York in 1999 toward the end of his presidency. He and Hillary needed a place to live after leaving the White House, and they chose Chappaqua, a wealthy suburb about 40 miles north of Manhattan in Westchester County. The house is a large Dutch colonial-style structure with white siding, black shutters, and the kind of affluent suburban normalcy that screams, "We're relatable now, we promise." The Clintons bought the house for $1.7 million, which caused a minor scandal because it raised questions about how they'd afford it. They'd left the White House deeply in debt from legal fees related to impeachment, the Whitewater investigation, and various other scandals that dominated the late 1990s. The mortgage was substantial. Their finances were a mess. But book deals were coming. Speaking fees were coming. They'd figure it out, and they did spectacularly. Within a few years, they'd paid off everything and then some. The Chappaqua house has 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a pool, and a barn that was converted into office space for Secret Service and staff. The property sits on 1.1 acres in a quiet residential neighborhood where the median home price makes you want to lie down. Hillary used the house as her base during her time as a U.S. Senator from New York from 2001 to 2009, then as Secretary of State under Obama from 2009 to 2013, then during her 2 presidential campaigns in 2008 and 2016. Bill used it as his post-presidential headquarters for the Clinton Foundation and his various speaking engagements, which paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars per speech. The house is deeply, aggressively suburban. The Clintons would shop at local stores, attend community events, and generally try to be normal residents of Chappaqua. which is hard when you're surrounded by a Secret Service and have been president and first lady and senator and secretary of state. But they tried. Neighbors reported seeing them at the grocery store. Bill would jog through town. Hillary would attend local fundraisers. It was all very, we're just like you, except for the part where they absolutely were not. The house became a symbol of their post-White House life. Prosperous, politically active, and deeply enmeshed in the Democratic establishment they'd both spent decades climbing. It's where Hillary prepared for debates, held strategy meetings, and processed two devastating presidential, primary, and general election losses. It's where Bill wrote his memoirs, managed his foundation, and figured out how to stay relevant without overshadowing his wife, which he wasn't always successful at doing. The Clintons still own the house, though they also bought a place in Washington, D.C. in 2016 to be closer to their daughter Chelsea and their grandchildren. Chappaqua remains their official residence, their base, their suburban retreat from public life when they occasionally want it, which isn't often because neither Clinton has ever met a spotlight they didn't like. The Clinton house ranks mid-tier. It's nice, but not exceptional. It's suburban, which is almost aggressively normal for people who are anything but normal. The house represents a shift in presidential retirements. Less rural, less grand, more practical. Clinton didn't need a ranch or compound. He needed proximity to New York City, access to airports, and a place where Hillary could run for Senate and later the presidency. They got exactly that. The house is fine. The Clintons are fine. Everything is fine, which is the most Clinton sentence possible. Suburban and surprisingly normal, which makes it notable precisely because of whose house it is. But at least Clinton stayed on the East Coast. The next president went back to Texas. George W. Bush, Prairie Chapel Ranch. George W. Bush bought Prairie Chapel Ranch near Crawford, Texas, in 1999, right before launching his presidential campaign. The timing was not coincidental. Bush needed to establish his Texas credentials, even though he'd been born in Connecticut and went to Yale and Harvard. The ranch sits on 1,500 acres of scrubland in McLennan County, about 25 miles outside of Waco, and the house is a modern, eco-friendly, one-story structure designed to be energy efficient, which surprised everyone who assumed Bush didn't care about the environment. The house uses geothermal heating and cooling, collects rainwater in a 25,000-gallon underground cistern, and was built with sustainable materials, including native limestone. It's actually quite forward-thinking for 1999, which no one expected from Bush. The house was designed by a University of Texas architecture professor, and it's a model of environmental consciousness, which makes Bush's actual environmental record as president even more ironic. The house is green, his policies were not. Bush called the ranch the Western White House during his presidency from 2001 to 2009. He spent over 490 days there during his 8 years as president, which is more than a year total. That's a lot of vacation, though Bush insisted he was working the whole time, just with better scenery. Bush loved clearing brush, which became a running joke and a constant photo opportunity. He'd put on a cowboy hat, grab a chainsaw, and cut down cedar trees for hours while the press took pictures and made jokes. It looked ridiculous. He didn't care. He genuinely loved it. Bush wasn't faking his love of manual labor. He enjoyed the physical work, the Texas heat, the solitude of the land. He'd drive around in his pickup truck, check on the cattle he kept on the property, and generally play rancher while running the country. It was authentic, even if the political optics were calculated. Bush knew exactly what image he was projecting. The cowboy president, the regular guy from Texas, the man who cleared brush and made tough decisions. It worked for his base. Bush entertained world leaders at the ranch, continuing a tradition Reagan had started. Vladimir Putin visited in November 2001. Tony Blair visited multiple times. Angela Merkel visited. The King and Queen of Saudi Arabia visited. which must have been interesting given that Saudi royalty probably don't spend a lot of time on rustic Texas ranches. Bush's brand of cowboy diplomacy was literally conducted at a ranch, which is so on the nose it almost feels like satire. But Bush was genuine about it. He loved Texas, he loved the ranch, he loved the image of being a rancher president, and he leaned into it fully. After leaving office in January 2009, Bush and his wife Laura moved to Dallas and bought a house in the affluent Preston Hollow neighborhood. They kept the ranch but spent less time there. Bush took up painting, which surprised everyone, and he got pretty good at it. He wrote his memoirs, gave speeches, and generally stayed out of politics, which made him more popular in retirement than he'd been as president. The rehabilitation of George W. Bush's image is one of the stranger legacies of recent political history. Bush sold Prairie Chapel Ranch in May 2024 for some reason, presumably because Dallas was more convenient and the ranch required upkeep he no longer wanted to deal with. The sale felt like the end of an era. The ranch had defined his presidency visually. Without it, he's just another former president living in a gated community. Prairie Chapel Ranch ranks mid-tier for authenticity. Bush genuinely loved it, but it was also clearly part of his political brand. The eco-friendly house was progressive. The brush clearing was both real and performative. The whole thing was simultaneously authentic and calculated, which is very Bush. He meant it. But he also knew how it looked. Cowboy diplomacy had a home base, and it was a sustainable ranch in central Texas. Make of that what you will. But the next president preferred city life. Barack Obama. Obama House. Barack Obama broke with tradition after leaving office in January 2017. Instead of returning to his home state of Illinois or buying a ranch in some symbolic location, Obama and his family stayed in Washington, D.C. They rented, then bought, a large brick mansion in the Kalorama neighborhood, the same upscale area where Woodrow Wilson had lived decades earlier. The house is an 8,200 square foot Tudor-style structure with 9 bedrooms, 8.5 bathrooms, terraces, gardens, and all the features you'd expect from a house that cost $8.1 million. Obama stayed in D.C. primarily so their younger daughter, Sasha, could finish high school without disruption. But staying also meant remaining politically accessible, close to the center of power. Most presidents flee Washington after their terms end. Not Obama. He purchased the house in May 2017, settling into a neighborhood filled with diplomats, politicians, and wealthy professionals. The family also owns a house on Martha's Vineyard, which they bought in December 2019 for $11.75 million. 29 acres, right on the water. Between the two properties, the Obamas positioned themselves to stay relevant and comfortable. D.C. for work, Martha's Vineyard for rest. The Kalorama House became Obama's base for post-presidential activities. The Obama Foundation, his Netflix production deal, memoir writing, and occasional political commentary. He remained publicly active, speaking out, and continuing as a voice in Democratic politics. The house facilitates that. It's central, elegant, and very much a statement. I'm not going anywhere. The house itself is beautiful. Tudor-style architecture, meticulously maintained gardens, high ceilings, elegant interior design. Michelle has been involved in making it feel like home rather than just another staging ground. Obama's decision to stay in Washington broke modern tradition. He didn't need a ranch or hometown retreat. He needed proximity to power, and he got it. The house ranks high for breaking convention. Modern, elegant, and strategically positioned exactly where the action is. But staying in Washington isn't the only way to remain in the spotlight. Donald Trump, Mar-a-Lago. Donald Trump's primary residence, Mar-a-Lago, sits on 17 acres in Palm Beach, Florida, between the Atlantic Ocean and the Intracoastal Waterway. Trump bought it in 1985 for approximately $8 million after the original Owners Foundation tried and failed to donate it to the federal government. The government declined, citing astronomical maintenance costs, and Trump acquired what would become his most famous property. Mar-a-Lago was built between 1924 and 1927 by Marjorie Merriweather Post, heiress to the Post's cereal fortune. She designed it as a winter retreat, filling it with Spanish tiles, Venetian glass, European antiques, and enough architectural drama for a Mediterranean palace. The name means sea to lake in Spanish. The estate has 126 rooms, 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, and sprawling Mediterranean revival architecture. Post wanted Mar-a-Lago to become a presidential retreat after her death. She left it to the federal government in 1973, but maintaining it proved too expensive. The property returned to her foundation in 1981. Trump bought it 4 years later. Trump converted Mar-a-Lago into a private club in 1995, charging membership fees while also maintaining private residential quarters. It became both home and business, which is quintessentially Trump. The property includes a 20,000 square foot ballroom, spa, tennis courts, and beach access. During Trump's presidency from 2017 to 2021, Mar-a-Lago served as the Winter White House. He spent approximately 250 days there, hosting foreign leaders, including Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Official business sometimes occurred on the outdoor patio, visible to club members, which raised eyebrows among security professionals. After leaving office in January 2021, Trump made Mar-a-Lago his permanent residence, having changed his primary residence from New York to Florida in 2019. The estate became his base for post-presidential activities and political organizing. Mar-a-Lago ranks high for sheer scale and opulence. Post's vision was grand, and the property delivers. It's one of America's largest private residences, functioning simultaneously as home, club, and political headquarters. Impressive, unconventional, and distinctly Trump, but after all that Florida sunshine and gold leaf, the next president preferred something quieter. Delaware, trains, and home. Joe Biden, Biden residence. Joe Biden owns a house in Wilmington, Delaware, where he's lived for decades. It's a large, lakefront colonial-style house in the Greenville neighborhood, purchased in 1996 for $350,000, though it's worth several million now. The house sits on 4 acres with a man-made lake, tall trees, and the kind of upper-middle-class suburban comfort that defines Biden's entire political persona. Nice, but not a mansion. Big, but not ostentatious. Biden famously commuted from Wilmington to Washington by Amtrak every single day during his 36 years as Delaware Senator. After his first wife, Nelia, and infant daughter, Naomi, were killed in a car accident in December 1972, weeks after his Senate election, Biden made a decision. He would go home every night to his surviving sons. So, he commuted. 90 minutes each way. For 36 years. He earned the nickname Amtrak Joe. The house became his anchor. Between his vice presidency from 2009 to 2017 and his 2020 presidential campaign, Biden spent significant time there. His garage became a recurring image during interviews, partly because of his 1967 Corvette Stingray, which he clearly loves and frequently mentions. Biden's attachment to Delaware is genuine. He represented the state longer than most people live anywhere. When he became president in January 2021, at age 78, he continued returning to Wilmington most weekends, commuting via Air Force One instead of Amtrak. The house has been updated with security infrastructure since Biden became vice president and president. Security perimeters, fencing, Secret Service presence, but otherwise it's the same house, same neighborhood, same lake, same Corvette. Biden's presidency continues as of this writing. Whether he'll retire to Wilmington full time remains uncertain, but the house has been home for nearly 30 years. It's where he raised his children, mourned tragedies, and planned political comebacks. The Biden residence ranks high for authenticity and consistency. It's not a compound, ranch, or beach estate. It's a house in Delaware where a man who loved trains kept coming home every night for decades. The Amtrak connection is iconic. The Corvette adds character. And Biden genuinely seems to love Wilmington, which gives the house authenticity some presidential estates lack. Comfortable, unpretentious, and deeply rooted in one place. And that brings us to the present. 45 presidents, 45 homes, and more questionable real estate decisions than you'd expect from people running a country. We've seen mansions built on contradictions, ranches where world leaders awkwardly cleared brush, and suburban houses that tried very hard to seem normal. We've toured homes that no longer exist, turned into parking lots, or forgotten entirely, and we've seen homes that are still standing, still preserved, still waiting for visitors to judge their wallpaper. So, the next time you're scrolling through the history and wondering how we made it this far, just remember, a president once named his house after Robin Hood because he was mad about getting kicked out of his party. Another one commuted by train for 36 years because he refused to abandon his family. And one built a 300-foot-long house just to prove a point. Architecture reveals character. And sometimes character is deeply weird. Now close your eyes. Dream of front porch campaigns and secret staircases. And be grateful you're not responsible for decorating a presidential estate. Sleep tight.